Yeah. All right. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this. And it's not quite 7, but if anybody comes in, a lot of this early stuff is introductory anyway. So, introduction. Tonight's presentation, we'll talk about a lot of stuff, the founding of the parish. And part of this is the role that we've played, not just around here, but in Kentucky Catholicism and American Catholicism. And that sounds like a pretty bold statement, but it is without a, oh, sorry, this way? Okay. Without a doubt, our role is that big, and we'll talk a lot about that as we move forward. This area is known as, some people call it the Kentucky Holy Land, some people call it the American Holy Land. The Holy Lands being Nelson, Marion, and Washington counties, which is where most of the Catholics that came from Baltimore over the Allegheny Mountains settled here in central Kentucky and were the first Catholics in the state. And Bishop Flaget, when he wrote to Bishop Carroll back in Baltimore, actually said the people here were like a little Bethlehem, the Holy Land in the Middle East, and that we were becoming our own little Holy Land as we grew and expanded. So that's where that phrase comes from. And this book, written by Father Clyde Cruz, An American Holy Land, is the history of our archdiocese. It was written in 1987, and that's where he got that as well. So it's frequently referenced as the Holy Land. Thank yous to any and all historians, written and oral. This was an oral history of our parish for more than 200 years. I grew up with it, and I was surprised once I found documentation of so many things, how accurate the oral tradition was. It was really pretty spot on. Anybody who's familiar with the Centenary of Catholicity in Kentucky, which is a mouthful, that was the first history document of the diocese, what would become the Diocese of Bardstown, and he was the only source for a long time on what happened in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So definitely a thank you to him, and we'll talk more about him later. Father Cruz from Bellarmine. When I was 18 years old and a freshman at Bellarmine, I went to a lecture he was giving on Kentucky's role in the Civil War, and he stood up there and dates and times and places with no notes whatsoever. I was overwhelmed, and so I introduced myself to him, and he asked where I was from, and I said Bloomfield, and he said, "Oh, Nelson County, the Holy Lands, do you go to St. Michael's?" And I was pretty green back then, you think? I was really green back then. So I thought, how does he know where Bloomfield and St. Michael's is? And I said, "Yeah, that's right." And he said, "Are you a descendant of Grace Newton Simpson?" And I thought, wow, so this little history that I know is a little bigger than I realized. Then he went on to tell me a whole lot of things I didn't know, as things that we'll be covering here shortly. But he went on and on about that. So he also wrote, actually, in my book here, which I have copies here. If you don't have one and want one, I've got those tonight. He wrote one of the blurbs on the back for me there. So this is meant to be interactive. Don't wait till the end. If you've got questions, raise your hand and we'll cover them right then and there on the spot, because there is a lot of information and I'm going to get through it as quickly as possible. But our story is big, and it's not just old. It is old, but it's also new and current, and there's a lot going on all the way through the middle as well. Background. Family tree has a lot of branches, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit tonight. You'd be surprised some of the places and people and things that we're connected to, both from time past and even today. Hey, Connie. All right, so St. Michael's was founded in 1792, which was the same year that Kentucky became a state, and that makes us the third oldest parish west of the Allegheny Mountains. Holy Cross was founded in 1785. That was the first, and then one other in between there, but we were 225 years old last year, and we celebrated that in September, and then on October the 1st we had a celebration for a historical marker at the cemetery, and I've also got in here a picture of our oldest intact tombstone. There's the marker with some stuff. We're going to cover all of that that's on there. That thing, I worked on that, and there were a certain number of characters that could be on each line. And with 225 years of history, that was pretty difficult. So there's some abbreviations. I don't think there's any bad grammar in there, but there's definitely some words that I had to abbreviate. And I hated words like Alleghenies because that took up so many characters out of one line. It's driving me crazy. And that's just the other side of the sign that's out there. That's at the cemetery. There's our oldest intact marker that belongs to Francis Coombs, and then he's also got the military marker there at the bottom. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. I don't know if you can see that at the bottom. He was born in 1726 and died at age 96 in 1822. And that is, as you're going up the entrance and then you veer around to the right and back to the left and up the hill, he's right there on the right, pretty close to the drive there. I like to point out that this is not just about people and places. Our history is a story of action, things happening, people taking action and achieving things. So by no means is it just here's a picture of our church and here's a person who was here in 1792. There's a lot more to it than that. And it's not just a parish history, much bigger than that. The branches, as mentioned earlier, spread very far and wide. And it's not even just Kentucky history. It's a story about the first leg of the westward expansion of Catholicism. So our ancestors, if you're tied to the original settlers, came here from Baltimore to central Kentucky, but by no means was it the end. In fact, I was talking with somebody earlier who's a descendant of the Knotts, K-N-O-T-T, and they settled here, but there's not a single one buried in our cemetery because they weren't here long enough. They moved on to around the Owensboro area in Davis County. In the second leg of that expansion, we have documented people, mostly priests and some sisters, who were born and raised here and then became priests or prominent people in all of these locations. And we'll talk about quite a few of those as we move forward as well. So it became kind of the springboard for Catholicism in the westward expansion along with the general population. Father Cruz wrote on the back there, and on the little blurb on the back, that those with an interest in ecclesial history far beyond northern Nelson County will find this a fruitful and engaging work. And I put that in there just because it's basically what I'm saying, that you don't have to just be interested in St. Michael's or just in local Catholic history or even Kentucky history. It goes quite a bit beyond that. So the book is titled Pioneer Faith. Pioneer's definition in Webster's is one that begins or helps develop something new and prepares a way for others to follow. And as you'll soon learn, we definitely did that. I like to do this. The confirmation group, in fact, a couple of them back there said, "Oh, the laptop and the screen." I use this a lot in our sessions. But this one, I like to call this, it's What If I Told You? Because if somebody came and visited our parish and saw the size and the regular looking people here and realized what our history was, they would be shocked. So what if I told you that this parish was called by one historian the cradle of religious vocations in Kentucky, and that several dozen religious vocations were born of St. Michael parishioners? And I detail those throughout the book. What if I told you that the parish became a springboard for the growth of American Catholicism as the country continued to push westward? Touched on that briefly, and we'll do so again momentarily. What if I told you that St. Michael's first priest was also the first priest ordained in the United States? That's a nice little tidbit, and we'll get into his story. He landed here, and boy, we had some friction. So we'll cover that in great detail. One of the names for Fairfield originally was Turkeytown, and there was an article written called "The Tempest in Turkeytown," and it was about our relationship with this priest. So it wasn't that great. What if I told you that the first resident pastor at St. Michael's would later become a bishop? What if I told you that 4 of the pastors would eventually become bishops? And what if I told you that the foundress of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth was a native of St. Michael's? And what if I told you that a second native of St. Michael's would also serve as the Mother Superior of the Sisters of Charity? And here's the one that's amazing to me. 50 out of the first 61 years that the Sisters of Charity existed, the Mother Superior was a native of our parish. Those two basically, they would serve 6-year terms, and Mother Catherine, who we'll talk about, would serve one, and then Mother Frances would serve one, and they went back and forth for several terms with just a few people kind of interspersed in between. What if I told you that one of the original settlers of the parish was called by historian Ben Webb of the Centenary Book one of the most extraordinary Catholic women of her day, not in Fairfield, not in Kentucky, but as it says, in all America. That this same woman had as personal acquaintances from her days in Maryland, Bishop Carroll, and as I put there, some guy named George Washington. And those are documented that she had personal correspondence with both of those people. And what if I told you that according to Father Cruz at Bellarmine, this same woman was very influential in the appointment of Flagey as the first bishop of the Bardstown Diocese. And what if I told you that Presentation Academy in Louisville, it goes back to 1831, is the oldest high school in Louisville that's been continuously operating, was established by a native of St. Michael's. That Spalding University in Louisville was established and named after a St. Michael's native. And that so far we've only talked about the women, long before they even had the right to vote. And then what if I told you that the first Catholic bishop in the state of Tennessee, and the subject of this book, this big thick book titled The Father of the Church in Tennessee, was a native of St. Michael's. And that's him. His name is Richard Miles, M-I-L-E-S. He was born and raised here and became a Dominican priest and eventually the first bishop in the state of Tennessee. That St. Michael's first priest, who was Father Baden, interestingly enough, his name is B-A-D-I-N, and there was some confusion over whether that was Baden or Baden. So I emailed Father Cruz one day and said, how do you pronounce this? But email being what it is, there's a limitation there. So he actually replied, I've always referred to him as Baden like he's a varmint. Okay, I know what you mean. Not a Baden, but a Baden. And he basically traveled all over several states and later bought land, came back to Kentucky, and thought he would get back there and never made it, so he donated the land that became the University of Notre Dame. There is a building on that campus to this day called Baden Hall, and he is buried there. And we'll get into that a little more later as well.
What is in the water around here?
I tell you. Can't you tell we're holy people? I don't know if anybody lets you know that, but I mean, you should be able to tell.
We drink holy water.
And what if I told you that the first Catholic parish in Louisville, which was called St. Louis Church, was founded in 1811, and it was a mission of St. Michael's. And that this former mission of St. Michael still exists today, but not under the name of St. Louis Church. So what if I told you that that first church in Louisville that was once a mission of St. Michael's is known today as the Cathedral of the Assumption?
I knew that was coming.
See, I planted her in the front row. So the cathedral was most definitely, and again, all this is documented. This isn't something I heard. Was once a mission of ours, and we'll talk more about that. There's the cathedral's Kentucky historical marker. There's Father Baden's name, and then if you flip over to the other side, you'll see the name Catherine Spalding. So there's all kinds of references to our parish there. Pitt Academy, a very renowned special needs school, is one of the best known in the region, was founded and named after a native of St. Michael's. Felix Newton Pitt, that's Father Pitt right there. It actually eventually became Monsignor Pitt. He grew up here. And here's, I think this next one, is a really neat picture. Father Pitt is an altar boy. This is him right here as an altar boy at St. Michael's. There's the altar and everything behind him there. The communion rail at that time was not the marble, it's wooden, as you can see. That was probably very early 20th century, probably between 1900 and 1910. And if you need evidence that we're still relevant today, we've got plenty of it. I don't have this with me. I couldn't find it. I've misplaced it. But the Record, which is Louisville's Catholic newspaper that goes back to 1879, showed a native of St. Michael's celebrating her 60th anniversary as an Ursuline sister of Mount St. Joseph, and that her cousin, another native of the parish, was celebrating her 50th anniversary last year. And I happen to have a picture of both of them, and one of them is here tonight, Sister Grace Simpson, right over here. That's my aunt and my cousin, and I've got a picture. I found a picture of the two of them together, and the roses. Every rose has its thorn, and here it is. So there's Sister, Mary Elizabeth Ballard. We call her Mimi, and that's Sister Grace Simpson. Right there, 110 plus years between the two of them serving the Lord. Holy water. All right. What if I told you that this stuff right here, Henry McKenna, was made about 100 feet in front of the church, 100 yards or so in front of the front door of the church, and the building that's still a little bit falling down there, and that Henry McKenna was a parishioner and is buried in our cemetery under a tall obelisk. We've got a picture of him, but boy, it's very dim. That's a picture of Henry McKenna from way back in the day. There's a picture of an article. Now get this. Henry McKenna earlier this year, won an award at an international bourbon festival in San Francisco. This is a great little bourbon, but it won 2018 World's Best Bourbon. Best bourbon in the world, right here. Henry McKenna, originally made right down in front of the church steps down there.
Billy,
Yes.
my sister-in-law, who lives in Oklahoma, is a relative of the McKenna.
Is that right? We're going to talk about the McKennas. There's a bunch of them still around here, as far as not necessarily named McKenna, but there's a lot of their relatives still around here. It's our family tree. Where does she live, by the way?
She lives in Newkirk, Oklahoma.
Okay, so see, there's our family tree stretching out to Oklahoma. And there's plenty of examples like that. All right, there's the old distillery back in, I think that's in the 30s. And it's very, very faint, but there's St. Michael's steeple right there coming up above that tree. And there is our cemetery, this big tall obelisk, that's Henry McKenna's grave. And then there's a bunch of just smaller tombstones surrounding it for all the McKenna family members.
Billy, you gonna tell them why the McKennas came?
Yes, yeah, we'll get to that. So for people who aren't familiar with our cemetery, it's about a mile down the road here, and that's the landscape.
That's Pop Simpson's stone right there on the right.
We'll talk about him too.
Oh, great.
Believe it or not. Now, another article from the record from 2017 showed it was a picture of a brother and a sister who were both retiring, and they had both been in their lines of work for 45 years. The man was a priest down in Louisville's West End, and the sister was a teacher at St. Margaret Mary, where Father Bill Hammer is, family tree. And her name was Marty, and his name was Father John Burke. And there's a picture of Father Burke with Grace. And I think, is that your retirement party? I think that might have been your retirement party. And that's Father Burke, who recently retired after 45 years. And he and his sister, their grandparents, were married here. And, there you go, both served for 45 years. Their grandparents were married in 1919 here. And their grandmother's name was Mary Lee McKenna. And believe it or not, here's a picture of their wedding party. So that is Mrs. McKenna right here, and her husband, who was the Burke. And so Father Burke is their grandson. So the Gardners, you're in Gardner Hall. There's a little blurb about the Gardners over there on the wall. The phrase Little Moses applies to one of the Gardner girls who became a Sister of Charity. It was actually the one who was alternating with Mother Catherine Spalding as Mother Superior. And she wasn't that big of a person, so they called her Little Moses for her leadership. But the Gardner descendants, there were 3 sisters who joined the Sisters of Charity. There was an extensive amount of importance in the Gardner family. They donated the land where the cemetery is in our first church. When we first got here, the Mass, before we had a church, Mass was held in their house. And even today, if you're familiar with Louisville at all, you might have seen this sign, Gardner Lane Shopping Center. After about 3 or 4 generations, one of the Gardners moved to Louisville and bought a big farm. At that time, it was well outside of the city. As the city started to encroach on his land, they wanted to build a big road through it. And he said, no thanks. And so he sold the land to the city and moved out to Oldham County. And the road they built through there they named it Gardner Lane. So St. Michael's Connection, if you're down there on Bardstown Road by the Watterson Expressway. Now, another thing I discovered was there's a gentleman named Joe Hardesty. And Joe is the archivist at the Louisville Free Public Library. And Joe informed me that he's a descendant of the Gardners. And this picture this is Joe's grandmother, right there. This is Joseph Gardner. He's the one that moved to Louisville. That picture was taken in 1910. And that little lady right there married a Hardesty, and Joe is her grandson. And now currently the head of the archives at the Louisville Library. The family tree keeps on growing.
Yeah.
Yes.
An update on Joe. He is now at the SAR.
Okay. Is he not at the
National
library
Court.
now?
Right.
Okay.
He's no longer at the library.
Well, I'll be darned. I was down there last week and almost asked to see him.
Yeah,
I would've-
but he's at the SAR.
Okay, very good. So he has moved on, but still a very prominent role with direct ties, of course, to our parish. So we're going to take a quick look back. We were settled in 1792, which is, of course, at the end of the 18th century. There was a word used frequently to describe Kentucky back then. There were very few people here. It was rather rough ground. And these three books are biographies on some of the early priests. Bishop Flaget has a book, and you're going to send, here's where I'm going with this. There's a theme. Bishop Flaget's biography is titled Cathedral in the Wilderness. Father Baden's book is titled Priest in the Wilderness. There's a Father Narek we'll talk about soon. He was a very big man, giant in the wilderness. So it wasn't exactly a metropolitan area back then, not that it is now, but it was even worse back then. So and I forgot there's 4 there. I don't have this one, but Father Fenwick, who was a priest here for a while, later became a bishop of Cincinnati. His biography, written in 2005, was called. He was a Dominican, and they're called friars. His was called Friar in the Wilderness. Believe it or not, I'm not kidding. So, from the 18th century to 1807, we underwent several name changes. We were originally known as the Cox's Creek Settlement. All of the Catholic settlements in the area settled clearly by a body of water, so they'd have a source of drinking water, and they just named themselves the settlement of whatever that body of water was. Once we were a little more established, and the family of Clement and Henrietta Gardner donated a room in their home as our chapel, the priests would travel a circuit. They would ride by horseback around to the different settlements, and they would call them stations. And they were basically named after whoever's property they were going to for Mass if there wasn't a church yet. So we were known as Gardner Station. And then because of all the wild turkeys, we were called Turkey Town for a while, and then there becomes a tempest. So we'll get to that as well. 1790, Kentucky's population was 73,000. 10 years later, it was 200,000. In 1800, there were 25 Catholics in the United States. The problem with that is there were 26 priests for 25,000 Catholics spread all over creation. So Bishop Carroll in Baltimore had a big problem trying to accommodate for that. By 1800, we had about 40 to 50 families here. And I put the words family tree in there to kind of, I wanted to talk a little bit about that in regard to, if you go back and you try to figure out, I know Father Bachelor's family goes back. Lily, are you Lily family? Are you part of the Lilies, which were original settlers? And you start to try to put those dots together, like, wonder if I'm related to this person 7 generations back. And when you realize 40 to 50 families, and they're here, and there's traveling is by horseback, and the next settlement is 40 miles away, well, you start to look around. I'm 18-year-old guy, and hey, I'm not related to you. Maybe this can work. And so literally became, who am I not related to here? And maybe that's who I'm going to marry. And so 7 or 8 or 10 generations later, we look back, and if it was a Simpson marrying a Lily, or an elder marrying a Gardner, and then you keep branching down through the generations, sure enough, we're almost all at least 7th or 8th cousin. So the family tree, again, comes into play there. That's Dr. John Lilly. He was a very prominent doctor in the area in the early 19th century. And one of the earliest picture we have of a priest that came from this parish is this guy. His name was Athanasius Aud, A-U-D. He was a real prominent priest throughout the middle of the 19th century. And he ended up, his family was. And he ended up, he was like a poet. He wrote all kinds of poetry, and he was a chaplain for one of the orders of sisters, very prominent guy that came from our parish. Now, early priests. Kentucky Catholicism got off to a bit of a rocky start. This first priest was Charles Maurice Wayland. He was an Irishman, and he was sent to Kentucky because by this time there were families here. There were a couple of settlements. Holy Cross had settled in 1785, and the problem was there wasn't much currency here. So Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, that was the only diocese in the country at the time, made an agreement with 3 or 4 prominent Kentuckians to pay Father Wayland a wage of, they were still using British currency, £100 a year, which is not very much, but he had to have some kind of living expense. So they agreed to the £100. When Father Wayland got here, there was some disagreements here and there, and they kind of balked at paying him. So he took them to court in the early days of the court system. And the judge ruled in Father Wayland's favor, but said because of the lack of currency, they were allowed to pay him in produce. And Father Wayland says, well, I don't want produce. That doesn't do me any good at all. So that was the judge's final ruling. So Father Wayland proceeded to give his homilies and just tear into these people who were what he considered to be reneging on their agreement. So then some of those people that he was getting after a little bit sued him for slander, and they went back to court. And this time the judge decided that he was guilty of slander and ordered him to pay £500 to those people, 5 years' wages. And Father Wayland said, I'm out of here. And he left the state. So that was our venture into Catholicism in Kentucky.
Is that where you can't get anything out of a turnip? He had the turnips, but he didn't have the money.
They offered him the turnips, and he said, I can't do anything with this. The second priest, both of these, of course, were before we were around, was William de Rowan. He was a much better fit for the area. He was a great educator and was a pretty good horseman, which was extremely important. But the problem in his case was he had a really bad alcohol problem. It got progressively worse. And aside from the fact that it made him unreliable and the educational side was suspect, he also it becomes problematic to try to ride a horse all over creation. So he had some big problems there. He actually stayed here, passed away, and is buried at St. Thomas. But he had great limitations on what he was able to do after that. So both of those, of course, were before we got here. So let's get to the man with the plan, Father Stephen Badin. I talked a little bit about his pronunciation. In this book, I talk a little bit about, it's unbelievable how prominent this guy was. So obviously in Kentucky, he stopped here, he established this parish. He was very prominent all over Kentucky. But if you listen to this on the website of Stephen Badin High School in Hamilton, Ohio, they describe him this way. He should be called the Johnny Appleseed of Catholicism in Ohio. So they're saying the same thing about him. I stayed away, that he's that important there. And then the website for the Department of History at Indiana University said no one has left a more enduring mark on the history of the Catholic Church in Indiana than the Reverend Stephen Badin. So in 3 different states, riding by horseback, he's being praised for his work in all of these areas. And as far as his background goes, he was French and was exiled during the French Revolution. Came to the country, became the first priest ordained in the country on May 25th, 1793. And then Bishop Carroll said, hey, here's a flatboat. Follow that down the Ohio River till you hit Kentucky. Then there's going to be a horse waiting for you, and we need you to get to Kentucky to take care of these people. So when he got here, having been exiled from his home country, trying to learn a new language, becomes the first priest ordained in this new country and sent to the middle of nowhere. All of that came before he was 25 years old when he got here, full of life experience and ready to go. Now, he was a really stern, hardcore priest, and I don't know if you can tell by this picture, but he was tough. And I've got a picture of him when he was quite aged and near death, and it looks like he had mellowed out quite a bit by that time, or maybe not. Yeah, so Father Baden was he was a tough character, and we'll talk some about that. Now, here's a number. I just plant the number 100,000 in there. Anybody got any idea what that might be?
Miles ridden.
He rode a horse 100,000 miles.
According to Catholic Encyclopedia, this isn't some cockamamie source, estimated that he rode 100,000 miles on horseback during his lifetime. And you can imagine, Notre Dame's a long way from here. I don't know if y'all have been there, but he was all over. He was in Missouri, he was in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and back and forth numerous times. Yes?
How did he keep his scalp?
That's a fair question. He had good relationships. He had good relationships with most of the tribes. They were generally, they saw priests as holy men, and even though it wasn't their type, they usually would let them pass, so to speak. They weren't in as much danger as everyday people. Baden's situation, I had talked about that. That's him getting here and being only 25 years old at the time. No help for him right away. He traveled to Kentucky with an older priest named Michael Barriere, and you can see how long he was here. He wasn't a very good horseman at all. He really didn't like the frontier mentality. As you can imagine, these were pretty hardcore, stubborn, set in their ways people, because you got to be pretty tough to come over the mountains and settle here, with no health care, no running water, no electricity, no nothing. And he didn't last very long at all before he tucked his tail and went back to Baltimore. In 1797, a priest named Michael Fournier came, and he was great. He was about 40. He was an excellent horseman. He was a very, very hard worker. He loved Kentucky and reached out to a friend of his named Anthony Salmon, and he came in 1799, and he was a young guy that was really getting after it. But as you can see, his situation didn't work out well either, because he was actually on a sick call by horseback one night, and he was extremely sick himself. He fell off his horse and suffered a head injury that he later died from, which was a big loss because everybody deemed him to be an excellent priest. Then later in 1799, John Thayer came. He was actually a convert from a hardcore Protestant religion and became a Catholic priest, and he stayed for a while. But he was, again, the horseback riding, he wasn't a very good horseman, and it became problematic. So his ability to move around was pretty limited. He and Father Baden didn't see eye to eye because Father Baden was everywhere constantly, and this guy was in a very small circle. They didn't see eye to eye, and as you can see, he left in 1803, and later that year, Michael Fournier, who was in the process of building a church, either had a heart attack or a stroke and died suddenly during some physical labor. So there we are at the end of 1803. Baden was once again the lone priest in Kentucky's, as it says there, wilderness, and as it says in all these books. So again, he found himself alone. At this point, he'd been here 10 years, and he's still the only priest at this point in the state of Kentucky, riding all of these circuits, and being the type of mentality he was made life difficult. We happen to have Father Baden here with us, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what his expectations were as far as Mass attendance. Father Baden, come on up here. Now I'm telling you, if you've ever missed Mass because you just weren't feeling very well or you had better things to do, Father Baden has a message for you.
First of all, you gotta admit, I look pretty good for someone over 200. Okay. Parishioners of Gardiner Station. There are very few reasons to ever miss Mass. Other than extreme illness, you are only excused from Mass if you have to walk 5 miles to get here or ride your horse more than 10 miles. Otherwise, I expect to see you here.
Good job. That's Colin Thomas as Father Baden. And as he said, you were excused if you had to walk more than 5 miles to get to Mass, or if you had to ride your horse more than 10 miles. So I use that one on my kids a lot. All right, so here we go. The good, the bad, and the ugly, 1805 to 1810. 1805 was a great year. Father Baden's fortunes changed for the better and changed permanently for the better. Father Charles Nerix arrived in 1805. He was from Belgium, and he was a pretty hardcore guy too, but not nearly as hardcore as Father Baden. Father Nerix was he was the giant in the wilderness, a big man, and was a church builder. He had built approximately a dozen churches around this area, and he would wear out the horses. They couldn't keep him with a fresh horse until he came across one named Printer. Printer has become an icon in Catholic history, especially Father Nerix founded the Sisters of Loretto. And if you've been there, the little town there where Sisters of Loretto are located is called Nerix, Kentucky. And Printer he's kind of a famous name around there. So Father Nerix arrived at that time. The Trappists arrived over at Gethsemane about the same time, as well as the Dominicans. So the Dominicans played a pretty big role in the parish, and we'll talk about that moving forward. And of course, they were over where at St. Rose. And I don't know if you've ever been to St. Rose. It's in Springfield, and you're driving down this little country road, and you go down the hill, and right when you get ready to come up, it's like the heavens shine down on this structure, and here's a picture of it. And it is just gorgeous. And so you're driving down this little country road, and bam, there that pops up as you're coming around the curve, and it is breathtakingly beautiful.
And it's a crown? Is that?
Yeah, and that's the original church is this area here. They had built on a little bit later, but that church dates back to just about the time of the Dominicans arriving.
Castle? Mary was talking about
Okay, there.
Mary
Nerix
Courtney talked about that.
was the church. Yes, sorry.
Where Mom and Dad got married.
Oh, is that right? Wow, that's great.
I grew up there.
Okay, yeah, there we go. Yeah, St. Rose is a gorgeous, and we took I don't know if you confirmation kids remember, we took a tour of the Holy Lands, and we were inside that church. There was nobody there. We might have snuck in, but it was worth it. Hey, Tom.
Married there too.
Wow, 2 people got married. Anybody else get married over St. Rose? It is a gorgeous church. Okay, so aside from the church builder and printer, Father Nerix was great with the kids. Father Baden was not, as you could tell from his face. Father Baden actually wrote a letter back to Bishop Carroll in 1806 that said that praised Father Nerix for his role with the children, because he realized how important it was. And he said of himself, Father Baden did, that the children are my cross instead of my crown. So he recognized that I can't handle these kids, but hey, this guy's going to be a big help because I don't have to deal with them. And here's a picture of Father Nerix. Big shoulders, big old guy there. And he has a role today at St. Michael's. My big old butt was up in the steeple of our church last week, getting a picture of a couple things up there. And there's a big, huge poplar beam that runs down through the middle of the church that came from a parish called St. Benedict in Little Mount. And when they tore that church down, most of that was used to build All Saints in Taylorsville, but that big poplar beam was used to build this church, and it's still there today. So Father Nerix's church building role actually extends to where we go to Mass every weekend, even to this day. All right, so 1806, Gardner Station becomes St. Michael's, but there's still work to do. They're raising money to build a church. It ends up, it's just a little, very small cedar structure, so it's not huge, but there's very little money available, and that becomes a source of friction as well. No documented source as to why they decided on St. Michael as the patron saint, but he being known as the defender of the faith probably has something to do with that, because before Baden got here, there's a group of a couple of dozen families who don't have a priest, they don't have a church, so they would literally gather in the Gardner home and have rosary services or prayer services of different kinds. And there were other denominations around. They could have just said, hey, there's a Presbyterian church over here, I think there's a Baptist church over here, but they stuck to their faith while they were waiting for a priest. And my guess is that probably has something to do with them choosing the name St. Michael's. There's, in the cemetery, this bench is there where the original church was located, which is right smack in the center of that property. Again, that was donated by the Gardner family. Now, here's where things get rocky. So, in 1808, the Bardstown Diocese was established. So in 1807, there's talk of Bishop Carroll saying, hey, we need to establish a new diocese. There's more and more Catholics. We're getting too spread out. I can't handle them all here. And one of the dioceses is going to have to be in the West, in Kentucky. So he calls Baden in to talk to him about this. So when everybody here realizes Baden has gone to Baltimore to talk to Bishop Carroll about a potential new diocese, they panic because they weren't crazy about Father Baden. They really didn't want Bishop Baden. So right away, there's a group of parishioners who start writing letters to Bishop Carroll describing some of Father Baden's tactics. Now, other parishioners defended him, but boy, some of these are documented. These are pretty tough. How do you like this for penance? Father Johnny, don't ever do this, please. So one of the things he gave for penance was, you need to recite an Our Father and a Hail Mary while you're holding this hot coal. Now that's pretty harsh, even for 1807. And another one was, I'm going to need you to go dig a shallow grave. That's never a good start. And I need you to lie in it for 1 hour a day for a week. So right away, these people are saying, this guy, he cannot be our bishop. Come on, Bishop Carroll. And among those were Grace Newton Simpson, the Elder family, particularly a woman named Nancy Elder. She was very outspoken. The Gardners were actually writing letters in support. So there were some very against and some that were supporting him, and it became pretty heated. Now, J. Herman Challenger was the author of the book, the biography of Stephen Baden, and he had an interesting description of our ancestors. He called them, I thought I had it in there. He labeled us as malcontents. So these malcontents were writing letters to Bishop Carroll. Now, the Dominicans, who were seen by our parishioners as more moderate, they were not as rigid and stern. So they were seen favorably by the people here. However, when they kept trying to get the congregation to support their priest, we turned on them too. And so there was one of their leaders was named Edward Fenwick. He eventually became the Bishop of Cincinnati. He referred to us as the meanest parish in the state of Kentucky. So we were 15 years in and not off to a very good start. So Father Baden, if there was one thing he hated, it was dancing. And there's a little geographic reference in here that you all will recognize. So he wrote a letter to Bishop Carroll and described this. Tumults arise at weddings and dances in Simpson Creek from that more comical than evangelical practice of electrifying the feet by the sound of the fiddle. So I guess the whole idea of Saturday night partying in Simpson Creek and showing up Sunday morning with some lingering effects was not something he was very proud of. Maybe that's why the hot coals came into effect. I don't know. So Bishop Baden was not a good idea. The letters to Bishop Carroll, the parishioners and the priests weren't getting along. And then Grace Newton Simpson she was kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak, because she was very well connected. She personally knew Bishop Carroll, and she knew George Washington, which doesn't really apply to this, but she had friends in high places, so to speak. And the idea that she was writing, another prominent letter writer was John Lilly. He was a member of the state legislature, and he was an atheist. He wasn't even Catholic, but he wrote a letter saying, my kids are being raised Catholic. This guy, I'm not a Catholic. I don't know what this guy's doing, but this is pretty harsh. And then he would say, and there's some people here who don't know how to write. They're illiterate. I'm writing on their behalf. So these letters became pretty prominent, and it led to the tempest in Turkeytown. And without reading that, it basically became any priest that defended Baden was being chastised. Any parishioner who defended Baden was being chastised. One of the letters was signed by a number of parishioners, including one named Joseph Blandford. And a week later, he wrote his own letter to the bishop saying, I retract my signature on that previous document because I was given way too much whiskey by the Gardner family, and they convinced me to sign it. Now, here's the thing. The guy he's referencing is the father of the 3 girls who became Sisters of Charity. So he's got 3 future nuns in his house, and meanwhile he's saying, you need to sign this letter, have another drink. So it was a very interesting time. So eventually, Baden, when he went to Baltimore, his whole thing was, he went to Baltimore and said, hey, I'm not your guy. He realized he was not the person to be the priest. Other than who's going to be the bishop, the other question is, where are we going to put this diocese? Danville was in the running, Lexington was in the running, and Baden went to Carroll and said, here's the deal. I think it needs to be Flagey, and I think it needs to be in Bardstown. And so while we were giving him a hard time, he was up there saying, here's what we need to do, and Bishop Carroll followed his advice. Just a little bit after that, Flagey wrote another letter to Carroll regarding Grace Newton Simpson and Company. She was the last hold on to, okay, he's not going to be the bishop, but can we still just get him out of here? So Flagey, I had this on our refrigerator for a while. Regarding Grace Newton Simpson and Company, be assured that I will do all that charity and justice demand. Their pride is the only obstacle to their reconciliation. So when I tell Cindy, well, my family's been stubborn for 200 years. You're gonna have to bear with me. And then the opening of the church, St. Michael's opened for services on January the 1st of 1810. This whole 1807, 1808, all the fundraising stopped, all the progress stopped. It was a terrible time, and the church did not get open until about 4 years after they had originally tried to get it started. Now, on to the Bardstown Diocese, which was established in 1808, along with 4 others. There were 4 total, including Bardstown. There were 3 others. Except for this table, does anybody know what the other 3 were, or where they were? You're gonna like this. Yeah. So there's Bardstown, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. So one of those doesn't appear to fit with the other 3.
Wilderness.
Yeah, Wilderness. There you go. Now here's the thing. Flagey was adamant about this his whole life, that the Bardstown Diocese was the most influential of all of them except the original one at Baltimore. And he always said, because look what we're doing here. We're spreading Catholicism across the United States. And he made a very good case that the Bardstown Diocese was more significant than New York or Philadelphia or Boston. There's a picture of Bishop Flagey. Now, the size of this diocese, it covered parts of 10 states, and today there are 43 dioceses carved out of what his original territory was. So again, I don't know if he rode 100,000 miles, but if he did, he was probably pretty close. Here's a map of what his responsibility looked like. So here's Kentucky and Tennessee, and his responsibility went from Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. Other than that, he had all kinds of free time. So he was given a huge responsibility, which again, that supports the fact that, hey, this is the significant diocese. We finally opened for services in 1810. Kind of, the church still wasn't finished. There was still a lot to do and a lot of obstacles to overcome, but we're getting there. So then finally, St. Michael starts to thrive, starting in 1811 through 1831. 3 future bishops. Bishop David, if you're familiar with Bishop David, he was here for a while in 1807. Bishop Chabras, which was another one of the Frenchmen. Bishop David, Bishop Chabras, Flagey, Baden, all of those came to America from the French Revolution. Chabras was our first resident pastor in 1816, and then there was a gentleman named Francis Kenrick, Kenrick, and he was a pastor here, and he was really well thought of. He eventually became the Bishop of Philadelphia and then the Archbishop of Baltimore, and he was our pastor here for a little while. Now, there's this place called Bethania. Bethania was a school started by the Sisters of Loretto in 1821. It was located right where the cemetery is. It was right across what's now Highway 48 in that area over there. Clement Gardner had died by this time, but his widow Henrietta donated 300 acres of land over there for the sisters' residence and a school. Unfortunately, it fell on hard times, and 6 or 7 of the sisters passed away from a kind of a mysterious illness within about an 18-month period, they were dying one after the other, and they eventually got recalled to the mother house in 1827. So it was relatively short-lived, but it was successful at the time. Father James Elliott is probably, if not one of the most influential priests in our history. He was newly ordained when he came here in 1829, and when he died in 1871, he was still our pastor. It was the only parish he ever served, and he served us for 42 years. During that time, we moved from the cemetery property to here. He oversaw the building of the new church, got us through the Civil War. There was a lot going on during his tenure. He was also a guy who he wrote hymns. He wrote church hymns, and they were frequently used throughout the diocese well into the 20th century. So 1806 to 1831, we're down in the cemetery. Then in 1831, we moved to this property on land donated by the McKenna family. Of course, their home was next door where Dr. Lockett currently lives, and they gave us this property to build a new church on, and we built a new brick church, quite a bit nicer than the cedar structure down in the cemetery. So basically, by 1831, there's a picture of Bishop David, who was he was here and became a bishop. This is Chabra, who was the first resident pastor here and later became a bishop. And that's Father Kenrick, who later became the Bishop of Philadelphia and Archbishop of Baltimore. And then, again, Father Elliott was here for 42 years, but he's another pretty tough-looking guy. That's, man, tough guy. But, man, oh man, he's buried in our cemetery, actually, down there. Only parish he ever served. So the McKenna family basically gave us a new start, and then in 2018 we had a reoccurrence, a reintroduction to the McKenna family. They had donated the altar that was in our church for years and years and years until our restoration in 2010, at which time we bought a smaller altar and put it in there. So we're restoring the altar in this room back here. And some of the extended family came and made a big donation to have that altar, so we gave that to them. And there's a picture of the plate that was on the side of it. It was donated in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Stafford McKenna from a couple of their children, and at the bottom it says, "Pray for them." So that was in our church for decades and is now back in the possession of the McKenna family. So by the end of 1831, we were... Oh, I'm sorry, and also in 1831, the Sisters of Charity reopened the school. So we had the new school open, we had a new parish on new property, a new brick church, and everything was great for a year. And then 1832 came along. Anybody know that date and what happened then? Cholera. The cholera struck. So the Sisters of Charity had to close the brand new school. Louisville became known as the graveyard of the West because, down and still even today, the Ohio Valley is terrible from a health perspective. And then there was Mother Catherine Spalding, who was very prominent. By this time, she had moved to Louisville and was very prominent in the cholera epidemic. And what would be neat is if we knew what it was like for Mother Catherine during this time, if there was some way for us to know what Mother Catherine did during this time, it would be just fabulous. And that's supposed to be Mother Catherine's cue. Oh, there she is. Mother Catherine is here with us. Mother Catherine Spalding is going to give us a little bit of a story about her life, and especially sometimes during this cholera epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to all that information. And that priest that was so tough on everybody, I met him on the way here. He said he's sorry. Well, I am so happy to be back in Fairfield, where I grew up, with the Gardner girls. And as you know, Harriet Gardner and Claire, I was especially good friends with Claire, and Frances all became Sisters of Charity of Nazareth with me. And Frances became my right-hand woman. We kind of alternated leadership. We had other sisters in leadership. And just to let you know a little bit, now you have heard of Bishop David. Bishop David was always kind to us, but he was always kind of egging us on a bit. And he wanted me to be the leader for the rest of my life for the Sisters of Charity. And I said, oh, I don't want to do that. I think that we need new ideas periodically and new leadership. And he kept insisting, and I kept insisting, so that was one of our little tiffs. And then he said, well, what about the sister in Maryland? She was elected leader, and she's going to be the leader until she dies. And I said, well, good for her, but I'm not, in a nice way. You had to talk to in a nice way, you know. So the Gardner girls were very, very instrumental throughout our history. Frances ended up serving 4 6-year terms each, and so did I. And there was others in between us. But it was good to have new thoughts, new ideas, new blood running through the congregation. And you mentioned the cholera. That was a horrible time. Well, at that time, I was very often in Louisville. And when I'd finish a term at Nazareth as being the head person, then I would go to Louisville to work with the orphans, because the orphans were my first love. Those poor little children. And you know why they were, don't you? Because I was an orphan. And thank heavens my relatives here took good care of myself and my siblings. My little sister Ann, as you might know, entered the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth a little later than I did. She was my younger sister. So as time went on, we were battling back and forth, the cholera and the yellow fever and all those terrible diseases. And I don't want to talk to you too lengthy because you're probably tired. But it went on and off and on. And in between, we were teaching in different places, in all different places. And then the outbreak would start again. And oh goodness, the Civil War. So when the seminary moved from St. Thomas, Kentucky, where we started in 1813, it moved to Bardstown, the seminary did. And then much later, I understand it moved to Louisville for the St. Thomas Seminary. Well, while it was there, it would turn into an instant hospital. In fact, courthouses turned into instant hospitals. And our sisters were there, nursing. The ones who were real nurses and knew what to do taught the rest of us what to do. So we took care of each other, and sometimes some of us would die doing that. But we were willing to serve and wanted to serve. Now, you mentioned poor Father Baden. Well, here's one thing I must take up for him for. I know he was rough. The Sisters of Loretta weren't really that crazy about him, and many of our sisters weren't either. But Father Baden gave us this phenomenal painting, a Rubens painting. You know who Rubens is, the artist. And we don't know why he gave it to us. He must have been from a family with a lot of means and had a lot of artwork maybe, and they would ship things over on ships from France and England, and they'd end up here and they'd have to find a new home. Well, maybe he gave it to us because he thought we'd take good care of it. Don't you think so, Father Joe Batch? Whom we all love dearly. So over the years, things changed, but there was constant illness and constant battles and things. And finally, when I was in Louisville, we took care of people who had cholera, people who had diseases, and don't you know that a pastor in another church dared to say that we were charging and being paid for our services. Ooh, that got my cockles up. And I could be sort of sassy in a nice way, but this one wasn't too nice. So when I had to confront Father David on a few things, when he wanted us to wear the black cap instead of the white, he wanted us to wear the black like Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton. I said, she was a widow, of course she wore a black cap. And she had 5 children. Of course she wore the black cap. We are working outdoors in the heat, in the gardens, with the children, all day long, going from white is much cooler than black, Father David. So anyway, I conjured up my anger and tried to tone it down. And this is the letter I wrote to the mayor and council of the city of Louisville. Gentlemen, at that gloomy period when the cholera threatened to lay our city in desolate, and nurses for the sick and poor could not be obtained by any means, nobody wanted to catch it, Reverend Mr. Abel, in the name of the society for which I have the honor to be a member, proffered the gratuitous services of as many of our sisters as might be necessary in then existing distress, requiring merely that their expenses should be paid, not that they be paid. Now, expenses were medicines, bandages, all of that was needed to treat the sick. This offer was accepted, and as the order from your honorable board inviting the sisters will now show, but the money was ordered from your treasury to defray those expenses. I had the mortification to remark that instead of saying the expenses of the Sisters of Charity, the word services was submitted. I immediately remonstrated against it and even mentioned the circumstances to the mayor and another gentleman of the council, upon being promised that the error should be corrected. I remained satisfied that it had been taken care of, and I went on until a late assertion from one of the pulpits of the city leads to me to believe that it stands yet uncorrected on your books, as these same books were referred to in proof of the assertion. So, if so, gentlemen, pardon the liberty I take in refunding you the amount paid for the above named expenses, well convinced that our community for whom I have acted in this case would far prefer incurring the expense themselves rather than submit to so unjust an odium and accusation. Gentlemen, be pleased to understand that we are not hirelings, and if we are, in practice, the servants of the poor, the sick, and the orphans. We are voluntarily so, but we look forward to our reward in another and a better world. With sincere respect, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Catherine Spaulding, Sister of Charity of Nazareth, February 10th, 1834. So you had to get a little sassy sometimes to defend yourself in those days. But we love the poor and the children, and we appreciated everybody's help, and it's just such a thrill to be back among Gardnerville.
Thank you so much. This is actually Sister Rita Davis. She is a Sister of Charity over in Nazareth.
Grace's over there.
So thank you, Sister Rita. That's great. I've been, I had extended an invitation to all the sisters, and she reached out right away and offered to do this. And I said, yes, absolutely. That 1834 letter was bold for many reasons. One was the rancor with which she spoke to the leadership of the city. And in this, this is Catherine Spaulding's letters written by Sister Mary Ellen Doyle. And then she also wrote the full biography of Mother Catherine Spaulding. And she refers to that letter as the essential Catherine, because she could get her temper up. But you look back on it, and here we are at St. Michael's and say, well, that's all fine and dandy what she wrote a letter to the city of Louisville's leaders, but what's that got to do with us? Well, she saw what happened here in 1807 and 1808. Can you respectfully talk up to authority if you feel like you're in the right situation? And she saw this happen in her very formative years. She was a young 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girl during this tumultuous time in the parish. And as she mentioned, she was an orphan. Her dad had left her. Her mom had passed away, and she was raised by extended family. And she always had the orphans were the number one place in her heart. So we're going to talk a little bit more about her coming up later. But so for now, we're going to talk a little bit about Fairfield. The parishioners and the business owners in Fairfield were always kind of one and the same. The McKenna family is a prime example. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Bank of Fairfield at one time was the president was one of the McKennas, and the vice president was my great grandfather Sam Simpson. And so the Shanleys owned a business. There were any number of people who had businesses downtown were also the parishioners of our of St. Michael's. Now, Fairfield, the glory days in population, in 1870, Fairfield's population was 167. In 1970, 100 years later, it had kind of fallen on hard times and had fallen to 163. So we had lost four souls in that 100-year period. So the whole idea of the population had never really affected the effectiveness of the town. There was a hotel, there was an opera house, there were doctors' offices, there was a bank. I mean, it was a pretty thriving town at the time. There's again a picture of the distillery during that time. You see the horse and buggies. Here's St. Michael's, the steeple right there in the church. And the McKenna house, Dr. Lockett's house now, right over here. There's an aerial view of the distillery property. This is taken from like back over on Murray's Run, so to speak. This is the part that's still standing. This was that's all actually a building now, but this piece here, some of that's still standing. But there's the bourbon warehouse. All of these properties over there are no longer there, but. That's the expansiveness that the distillery had during that time.
Now, they came here because of the road contract.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, the Highway 48, the road contract. That's what McKenna was at first. Is he was with the road contractors, and that's what drew him to the area. And when he saw Central Kentucky, he fell in love. And during that time period, the Irish were moving to the United States in droves. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. And of course, he got here. He had been working in Lexington, but came here and saw this and said, "Boy, this is where I want to be." Got here and said, "We need something to drink," and decided to go into the bourbon industry. So this part here is a little more brief. Things did come full circle with Father Baden. Now this is extremely ironic. So Thomas Elder was one of the original parishioners, and his daughter Nancy was one of the letter writers against Father Baden. He and Grace Newton Simpson. And in a letter in 1808, I think it was, Father Baden had written to Bishop Carroll and called Grace Newton Simpson and Nancy Elder pious Amazons. So they were not getting along. And but now here's the interesting part. Thomas Elder's grandson by this time was the Bishop of Cincinnati. Father Baden had died in Cincinnati and was originally buried there. And the University of Notre Dame said, we would love to have him buried up here, since he, in some places, is considered the co-founder of the university. And the request to move Father Baden's remains to Notre Dame University was granted by Bishop Elder, the grandson of Thomas Elder of St. Michael's Parish. So see, all's well that ends well, because literally a grandson of one of the headaches of Father Baden had agreed to assist moving him to his final resting place. Immigration issues. The Irish and the Germans were coming into the United States. A lot of Irish people came to Fairfield, not just the McKennas, but if you know, right down the road, there's Irish Ridge. We're going to talk about another profound Irishman that settled in our parish shortly. But this became problematic. And in fact, in Cindy's family, her maiden name is Pank. I don't know if any of you remember Father Pank. There were two of them. Those were her uncles. And they were a little father badnish, if you want to know the truth. they were pretty hardcore. But the Pank family, when they came to the United States, they were Von Pank. But because of the harsh criticism of the Irish and Germanists, they dropped the Von because, you know, they looked just like everybody else. So they thought, hey, if we're just Pank and not Von Pank, people might not know. So there became a statewide convention in Kentucky to deal with two things, slavery and immigration. And the immigration piece was they wanted Catholics to wait 21 years before they could become a citizen. And it was that was pretty difficult. And what happened was a gentleman named James Guthrie worked with Mother Catherine to vehemently oppose this, and he was the president of the convention. He was eventually a U.S. senator, the secretary of the Treasury, the president of the L&N Railroad, prominent guy. Guess where he grew up? Bloomfield. He and Mother Catherine knew each other. So they were working together behind the scenes to fight this, and they voted 69-6 against that. Another part of this whole thing, Bloody Monday, was in 1855. The Irish and Germans, it was an election day thing. The editor of the Courier Journal had written extremely negative articles about Catholics and trying to keep them from voting. So on the day of the election, literally they were being blocked from voting, and there became a riot in which many Irish and German Catholics were killed. And that was known nationally today as Bloody Monday. And George Prentice was the editor of the Courier Journal at that time, and he ended up with a statue in front of the Louisville Public Library. That's the back of his statue facing the library. But as statues go today, they're not very popular, and his is going to be taken down. But before they could take it down, somebody vandalized it. So that's what it currently looks like. I took that picture last week. So his statue has been vandalized and is going to be removed because of his indirect role, at least, in the slaughter of those people. There's James Guthrie's marker right outside Bloomfield City Hall. He was born near Bloomfield and was very prominent in Louisville and in Kentucky, and then later, like I said, was Secretary of the Treasury. Now, there's a picture of Mother Catherine. She doesn't look like somebody who would write a letter like that, but she was very determined. Now, here's some more information about her. The only statue of a woman on public property in the state of Kentucky is Mother Catherine. It's right there in front of the cathedral on 5th Street in Louisville. Portrays her with her favorite people, the orphans, and that was the work she was doing that she loved the most. So when I had the confirmation class last year, we went to Louisville to do a little bit of charity work and to tour some of the places that were relevant to St. Michael's. So you're dang right we took a picture with Mother Catherine. Hey, and y'all might recognize this guy. That's Father Michael Wimsett, former associate pastor here. He's now the pastor at the cathedral. He took us on a great, about a 2-hour tour of the cathedral and the crypts where Flageet's buried. So we got that picture with Mother Catherine. And then another day we took a trip to a Holy Land trip around to the old parishes, and we went to Nazareth and we took a picture with that statue of Mother Catherine. And then we took a picture at her gravesite. So I want to make sure these guys know this is your ancestor. And I've got some confirmation people back there. When we talk about all the people of our parish and how important they are, what do I tell you all the time? What question do I tell you to ask? Who's next, right? Just because she lived 200 years ago, that doesn't mean we're like, hey, we had Mother Catherine Spalding. Who's next? Who's going to be the next person to step up and do something? So she died on March 20th, 1858. We mourned at St. Michael's. The Sisters of Charity mourned. The city of Louisville mourned. They had many newspaper articles about her, speaking of her very kindly. And in 2003, the Courier Journal named the 16 most influential people in the history of Kentucky. Only one woman was on that list, and her name was Catherine Spalding. Sister Claudia was very important because this book here, Catherine Spalding, A Life in Letters, she kept a lot of Catherine Spalding's letters. She's the only person that did. A lot of the priests wrote to each other. They kept those letters for posterity. This is the only person that kept Sister Catherine's letters, and that's how we know so much about her. Sister Claudia, her last name was Elliott. Her brother was named Father James Elliott. He was our pastor here. St. Michael's is everywhere, I'm telling you. The Civil War, Father Elliott would travel to Louisville because he was still helping with the orphanage. His sister lived there. He was helping Mother Catherine, but he would always have to hide his horse. Horses were extremely valuable because both sides would swipe them from you. Morgan's Raiders struck the church bell over at All Saints. So not a huge Civil War factor around here, but that was a little bit of it. The Sisters of Charity were tending to the wounded in Louisville. And then President Lincoln wrote a letter. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, to Nazareth, saying, hey, hands off Nazareth. Leave the sisters alone. And they had that letter over there. I went over there and took a picture of it last week. That's Abraham Lincoln's letter saying, let no depredation or, hang on, I knew this. Let no depredation be committed, thank you. Be committed upon the property or possessions of the Sisters of Charity at Nazareth Academy near Bardstown, Kentucky, January 17th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln.
One other little thing about that. People say, why did he get it? Because Abe was very young then, and he had friends who had daughters and nieces in the academy, Girls Academy. And I wanted to invite everybody over to see our Heritage Hall. It's a museum, and that's where it is. And if you want to come on a weekday, you can see the actual one in our archives on the second floor there. I'd be glad to take you up. But his friends wanted protection for their nieces and daughters in the academy, and they were running around toward the end of the Civil War outside those windows, looking for fresh horses, food, water, and that was the girls' study hall, and they were in there, and so I guess the girls were looking pretty good to them, too.
And these
You can say that, I'm not going to say it.
were these Union or Confederates?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, both, absolutely.
And
of course, he's writing to the Union because the Confederates aren't
They
really
don't care, but I
right.
guess it worked, huh? They left them alone.
Yeah, it did work from all intents and purposes. The death of Father Elliott. Father Elliott died in 1871 and is buried in our cemetery. Unfortunately, his tombstone is broken, but it is still up there. Father James Elliott, and then we've got a better one of him, along with the Greenwells. Some of the Greenwells are here. Father Paul Greenwell was a native of our parish and died and is buried here as well in our parish cemetery. And then they included Father Elliott on there because his tombstone is so damaged. Mother Frances Gardner died in 1878. Here's a picture of her. No, they were English. Yeah. And then in 1883, a big year for St. Michael's. 1883 was the year that this current church was built, which makes it currently 135 years old and still going strong. So on July 14th, the record, basically I'm not going to read that, but it was just talking about the faithful parishioners of St. Michael's and all the work they do and their great relationship with their pastor. And if you remember a few slides ago, that had changed quite a bit through the years. 2 weeks later, was the laying of the cornerstone, and I am going to read this little snippet because one of these days we're going to have to address this, because within our cornerstone is something really interesting. There's a time capsule in there, and in it 142, in that time capsule are placed and sealed up in the cornerstone were the following names: Right Reverend Bishop McCloskey, Very Reverend M. Boucher, Reverend Father O'Callahan, he was our pastor at the time, Reverend Brady, Reverend Father O'Connell, the name of the President of the United States, the name of the Governor of Kentucky. There was also placed in it a copy of the Record, the Catholic Review, the Bardstown newspaper, as well as the names and the subscribers, and a likeness of Father O'Callahan. So all of that is sealed up in our cornerstone there if we ever want to try to get that out. I thought about talking about that during our 225th anniversary, but it just kind of slipped away. So the new church was dedicated on December 20th and still serving the parish to this day. The pastor at that time was Father Eugene O'Callahan, and here's a picture of him. He was an Irishman, and he was from 1871 after Father Elliott until about 1888. Now, Webb, who wrote the Centenary, the only source for the early years, but there's some good and some bad with that. Oops, one slide too many. So basically, when he was writing this book, he was going around to all the parishes and getting their archives so he could write the stories of all these settlements. Well, he was taking those with him and starting to write. Well, we get a little cantankerous around here. We said, you can stay here and copy some of this, but you're not taking our records. And so it became another stink. And the bishop intervened and said, give him the records because this is very important for the diocese. Everybody else is giving the records. You all need to give him the records. So we did, and we never got them back. So a lot of our archives are gone forever, apparently. This was in around 1880. In the 1920s, there was an effort to try to get them back. In the 1950s, here's a copy of a 1950s bulletin, by the way. The parish priest used to type that. And in that time, there was a note in one of those that said, this is 70 years later, that someone had contacted Mr. Webb's grandson trying to see if he knew where our records were. And that didn't work either. So we still got great archives, but the earliest of those are long gone. So our choir, we've got a great choir. A lot of those members are here. They're fabulous. Every time Archbishop Kurtz is here, he talks about it. But I can tell you one thing, there was a good choir at the turn of the 20th century, and I'm not trying to get on anybody, but they dressed way nicer than our choir does today. I'm just saying. I can check that out. I mean, if you go up in our choir loft today, you are not going to see that.
They wouldn't be allowed up there.
Connie.
We cannot go up the staircase dressed
Come
up.
on. Those hats won't fit. I knew there was a reason. Now, here we go. The Ursulines arrive at St. Michael's. The Ursulines are very beloved in this parish.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So the school's the Sisters of Loretto in 1821, the Sisters of Charity temporarily. Then there was St. Helena. Father Pike, who was a mentor of Felix Newton Pitt, was the pastor here for many years, and he started a school and got this lady out of Louisville named Helen Smith. And she started a school here in 1908, and it really was thriving. And within 5 years, it was kind of getting unmanageable for her, and the Ursulines came and kind of took it from there. So, show of hands, how many here went to St. Michael's School? I just want to get I do want to get an idea. 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. 10 people here tonight went to St. Michael's School, and it closed in 1968. So I'm not saying anything about anybody being old, and I'm just saying that was 50 years ago. So it's quite a few. And within the parish, there are still a lot of people who went to St. Michael's School. There's St. Helena School back in 1908. This is Father Pike off to the right there. Now, here's a little surprise. For those of you who were at Mass tonight, Father Bachelor was talking about being down in Texas visiting his niece, and they were also celebrating his mother's 124th birthday, had she still been with us, which is great because, isn't that what everybody wants? 124 years later that your family's still thinking about you? So here's a neat picture because this is Father Bachelor's mother right here.
Wow.
And this is Father Pike. And that's Felix Newton Pitt. So, there's just a bunch of school kids there, and look what that produced. Who's next, right? Who's next? There's a diploma from St. Helena Institute. That looks better than my diploma from Bellarmine. I mean, look at that. That's a grade school diploma from 1915. And so for a while there was St. Michael's Monthly, that they produced a monthly publication, and the writing in that thing was better than you see in newspapers today. It was phenomenal. Then in about 1910, there were some really talented kids. They were wanting to do plays, and they were wanting to play music, and they were talking about building an auditorium. And Father Pike said, "Wait a minute, we don't have that kind of money. That's we just can't do that." And the sister said, "Come on, Father Pike, we need to figure out a way to do this." And he said, "All right, you sisters pray to St. Rita. She's the saint of the impossible. And I'll go downtown and talk to some of our business owners and see what we can do." So he went down to the bank, and he found Mr. McKenna and Mr. Simpson, and they wrote a check, and the auditorium came into effect. And he said, all right, so he bought them a statue of St. Rita to place in the auditorium, and which it stayed there for many years. Then it was in the church, and then it went into storage until the early 21st century, when this came about, and we went, we don't have that kind of money. We need to pray to St. Rita. So when we finally made it, there she is. That's our statue from 1908 over there. And St. Rita is still watching over us today every time we run into something we think we can't handle. So enrollment, the first 10 years, it started with 20 students. And by the time 10 years had rolled around, they were almost up to 80. So it had really grown. That's why the Ursulines were called in. Sam Simpson, my great-grandfather, his wife passed away of tuberculosis, and in her honor, he bought the church bell that is still in the steeple today. That's his home, which is right down here by the corner of 509. It's still there. And here is they had to quarantine her in this little one-room place back here, and that's still there as well. And then when she passed, he bought the church bell, and that's why I was up in the steeple last week to get that picture. That's the picture of the bell, and unfortunately the inscription is gone where the dedication is written. It's not gone, it's still there, it just doesn't show up on the picture. Might need a wire brush or something, but so that's quite a gift in honor of his wife. That was done. She died in 1922, so that's been up there almost 100 years. This isn't of huge historical significance, but I just thought it was great. This is the Fairfield Reds from 1927 with the big bourbon warehouse in the background. I thought that was great.
Is Jim Simpson on there?
No, Jim's right there. Now, if you want,
6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
yeah. Oh, they only needed 9. They needed a sub.
Yeah.
They had to have a sub.
They only had
So,
9.
so in 1930, here's what our sanctuary looked like. So we still had, of course, the communion rail. That big crucifix is now in the back. There's the Blessed Mother statue, the St. Joseph statue. That painting is still there. All of that is still fairly intact, other than some of it has been moved to different places. The Sacred Heart statue is actually back in the back. We've still got that.
And about the cross on the top of the altar, we can't see it there.
I don't see it there. I can't even tell if it
It's
is
there,
actually.
it's there.
It is
You
there.
can't see it.
Okay.
But we have a parishioner that built it back.
Had to build it back. Mr. Prather right here in the front had to build that back because when the drop ceiling had been put in, they hacked it off. And so he had to recreate that. So job well done there, because I know that wasn't easy.
And is that the big altar that is now with the other?
No, the big altar was put in after Vatican II because they had to put that out front. So after Vatican II, the McKenna family donated that altar, and it was in there for probably close to 50 years.
Oh, that's not an altar in the front. That's the one.
That's attached. It's the one facing. I think
So the
it's
priest would
back.
be turned around.
Right, he'd be turned around.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Father Price. He was here during that time in the 1930s. Now, as we move into the 1950s, it was a great time for St. Michael's. The school was flourishing. The parish was doing well. We had Father Stewart to Father Foltz to Father Frankenberger. 1949, Father Stewart gets approval to build the school right over there the way. And the cost of that school, $2,000. So if any of you have even repaired a room in your house for $2,000, more power to you. That's Father Stewart in the back with the First Communion class from 1928. Father Foltz, some of the guys in here, I'm not going to name names, but there were a couple of guys in here that Father Foltz taught. There was a basketball team. And and Father Foltz had one rule. He would drive them to the games, and he wouldn't go in. He said, here's your one rule. Everybody has to play. Now, some of you are going to know this name. Their player coach was a guy named Dutch Elder. He was the coach. So the game was heated, and it was really close, and Dutch knew some of the guys hadn't played yet, and Dutch said, we got to win. We got to win. So some of you guys aren't getting in. So they managed to get back in the car, and the first thing Father Foltz said was, did everybody get to play? Silence. Silence. So he pulled them out of the league until they could assure him that things were getting straightened out. And then he taught him another life lesson. Several of them were out climbing on the trees in the front, getting the cigars off the talc tree so they could smoke them. The little cigar-looking things. And they thought that was funny. And then Father Foltz came out of the front of the rectory, and I think it was Bear, who was standing on somebody's shoulders, and they took off and they left him hanging there. So Bear Simpson, who used to take care of the cemetery. So Father Foltz the next day called them all in, and in the old days when you could teach kids real lessons, he let them smoke a real cigar until it was gone, and boy, that kind of cured that little problem. So the first parish bulletin was typed September 4th, 1955. That was Father Foltz, and he started typing that, and it would have great stories in there where he would sometimes express his frustration, like when people weren't attending the Stations of the Cross like he thought they should. So he typed in one issue of the bulletin, "Ain't it Lent at your house?" And that's Father Foltz. That's where'd the Green Wolf crew go? Are they still here? Okay. They had a picture and he was in it. I was trying to point that out to them. So in July of 1956, Father Frankenberger arrives with Fred, and he would frequently reference, I guess that was his brother, is that right? Okay. Yeah, and he would always say in the bulletin, he wouldn't say my brother, he'd say our brother Fred was working on the building or something like that. So he was here with him for a long time. So the glory days of the school from 1955 to 1958, the attendance is just skyrocketing up to 100 students. There's a picture of one of the sisters with the kids right out there in front of the house. The transportation, we had a bus that left here and would go around to Taylorsville and through Bloomfield and back, and then Father Frankenberger station wagon. I know some of you remember that. He would go down Plum Run and Murray's Run and Irish Ridge and pick up some kids along the way. And I'm pretty sure modern day seatbelt laws were not being followed.
Can I tell a real quick story about the station wagon?
Yes.
If I don't get this right, his brother Jerry. It was a hearse. It was a hearse.
Oh, it was actually a hearse?
Yes. His brother Jerry, they sat in the back in folding chairs now. And they took off down there at Plum Run, and somehow Jerry got off balance and fell out of the hearse out on the road.
See, I mean, you can't.
Here's
you
his
can't,
brother, right?
Yeah, he fell out of the hearse, which was serving as a school bus. You just can't. You can't find that today. You really can't. So that's one I'm going to skip over because we got something similar coming up, but there were some great names in there, but some of them are going to be duplicated, so I don't want to do that. We had a dental crisis at the 1959 picnic. A young boy named Ben Long. I don't know what this means, but he had lost a catch in his tooth. I don't really know what that means. But Dr. Horde, who is currently our oldest parishioner, Dr. Horde's well into his 90s, and he's still at Mass most Sundays. Ben went up to Dr. Horde and said, "I lost my catch." And all of a sudden, everybody's praying to St. Anthony so that Ben can find his catch. And they eventually do, and that took up 2 full paragraphs in the parish bulletin, which I thought was great. All right, so how about my at Christmas? The Christmas party let out early on the last day of school in December of 1959 because the kids wanted to go home and play some video games. No, not really. No, it was because the kids had to go home and milk the cows. That's a little change in the way life is today. Some of the parents said, "Can you please just let them out early? I need them at the house." 1960s. There were good times and definitely some bad times. School attendance began to drop from 100 to 95 to 88. It seems like, well, it's only 12, but that's also a 12% drop in only 2 years. Now, I do have to read this. First Communion Day, May 7th of 1961. There was a huge rain, and it was flooding. And I must read this just because both of these people are here. So, the Simpson farm had a bridge that was difficult to get over. So here's something that happened that day. The Byron Simpson family also could not get across the creek because it was too high. In order to get little Martha to church for her first Holy Communion, her brother Michael took her on horseback as far as the horse could take them. Then Michael carried his sister to the bridge at the Joseph Pitt farm, where Mr. Lawrence Ballard, their uncle, met them with a car and took Martha to church. We started services about 15 minutes late. And then a week later in the bulletin, some people are still wondering how Mr. Michael Simpson carried his sister Martha, carried her suitcase which contained her first communion clothes, and also took care of the horse.
We tied the horse to the fence and went on.
Mrs. Byron Simpson could not get to the church and so could not see her daughter, Sister Jean Michael, who is Grace, who is here today. She was there and they couldn't see her because they were flooded in. So, good times. Good times. Now, Mr. King, Suzanne's dad, and of course Carolyn's dad, who's our organ player, he became the parish picnic chair about this time, and he was also involved with the building of this hall 45 years later, and I remember asking him how those two things compared, and I'll never forget him looking at me right now and saying, sorry, this damn hall is nothing compared to those picnics. Evidently, and there are great details in the book about those picnics and all the labor that went into those. It was unbelievable. And it was basically, they kept the parish afloat for many years. The Assumption concession, on the Feast of the Assumption, the Angelus, of course, would read very early every morning, but realizing with Mass being at 6 a.m., Father Frankenberger decided that rather than ring the Angelus at 5:30, he would let people sleep in and not ring the bells till 6. So he was being very kind and generous there. Now, what about my letters to Santa people? Can I have those people come up, please? In 1961, the school children wrote letters to Santa Claus, and they published some of those in the parish bulletin. So we've got some people here. You're going to recognize some of the names of these parishioners as they read them because they're reading them as those people. So, Lane, I tell you what, why don't you step right over here one at a time, Lane? You come right here and you read yours. Here you go.
Dear Santa, my name is Stevie Long. For Christmas, I want a machine gun. I also want a bulldozer set and a fire engine. That's all.
Dear Santa, my name is David Simpson. I have tried to be a good boy and learn all I can in Sister Mercedes Ann's room. I would like to have a truck, a basketball, and if you see any tractors you think I would like, I would love to have that too. Thank you for bringing me those toys last year. Please bring Linda a doll that says Papa, and bring Elizabeth Gale a billy goat.
Teamwork on this one.
Dear Santa, my name is Elaine Bowling. Please bring me a Coke machine, a doll, and a doll suitcase.
Please bring my dad a necktie with only one edge, and my mommy wants a record player. She wants to get some records to learn how to dance the twist dance.
Dear Santa, my name is Tony Hurst. Please bring me a little tractor with a wagon so I can help my daddy. Also a movie projector so I can show pictures to my mommy. Also, extra set, I have been a good boy.
Dear Santa, my name is Rebecca Horde. I would like some clothes for my doll, some Play-Doh, and some color forms. Please bring my daddy an electric tooth puller.
That's Becky, as in our Dr. Horde's daughter, our dentist. So bring my daddy an electric tooth puller. I thought that was great.
Dear Santa, my name is Martha Jane Simpson. I want a doll buggy and some doll clothes. I also want a little spinning wheel and some fruit candy and nuts.
Sorry, Martha. That's Father Frankenberger's fault.
Dear Santa, my name is Patty Ballard. I've been a good little Tootsie Wootsy. I would like to have a doll named Roberta and a table. Bring a whole bag full of toys for my sisters and brothers. Bring Mother and Dad a big Cadillac.
So thoughtful back there.
Patty Kid Ballard has been a good little Tootsie Wootsie. That takes the cake right there. And her brother's here. I wish Patty was here, but that's all right. We've got it on video. All right, so the parish budget. I don't know if anybody here's paid Catholic school tuition recently, but the biggest item in the parish budget in 1962 was school expenses. Tuition, all of the school expenses for the whole year for every student totaled $3,400. Yeah, that hurts. That hurts. All right, so of course the 60s meant Vatican II. The school recognized the opening with a big celebration, but unfortunately during that time enrollment continued to drop, down to a 20% drop in 4 years. And at this time, Father Frankenberger says au revoir. In his goodbye in the bulletin, he wrote a big, long, great message in there about how much he missed St. Michael's and the people. And at the end it says, au revoir does not mean goodbye, it means until I see you again. And that's how he ended his goodbye message, which I thought was pretty good. There's Father Frankenberger. And so I know a lot of people in here remember him well. After Father Frankenberger was Father Hannafin, reincarnation of Father Baden in some ways. He was not real keen on implementing the changes that Vatican II brought about, and that caused some rifts along the way as well. But he baptized me, so he couldn't have been all bad. Enrollment continued to decline, unfortunately, down to 59 students in 1967. The school closed in 68, but what happened was the Archdiocese was already leaning on the parish to close the school, and some of the parents said, give us one more chance. We're going to try to get enrollment up. The school year previously had closed with only 57 students, so that what they had hoped was to get it back maybe up into the mid-60s. Not only did they not do that, they went from 57 to 43, at which time the Archdiocese said, we can't do that anymore. So St. Michael's closed for good in 1968. At same year, St. Joe Prep closed in 1968 also. Biggest reason was by this time, Archdiocese-wide, 50% of the teachers were lay teachers. There were fewer and fewer sisters. So all of a sudden, costs were being increased because, everyday people had to be paid significant amounts of money compared to what the sisters got, which was nothing practically. So the costs were going up, the tuition was going up, and fewer people were interested in paying that. Here's the last graduating class at St. Michael's, a whopping 4 girls. Here's Rebecca Horde that wants the electric tooth puller. Sister Paul Marie, Father Hannafin, and then 3 others there. It's one of the Hall girls.
Phyllis Hall.
Phyllis, and I'm not sure. I think one of them is a Lachlan, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, yeah. Sheila, and then who's this? Do you know? Yeah. Okay, gotcha. All right. Now, many of the old teachers came back many years for some of the school reunions. Here's a picture of one of those, a big group of the students and a few of the Ursuline sisters in there. And then last year, actually, Jane was there. Last year, I was invited to speak at the Maryland to Kentucky reunion to talk about St. Michael's and St. Thomas. And while I was there, I went over to the Ursuline property, and I got some pictures of some of the grave sites. Sister Mary Mercedes, Sister Mary Praxedes, Sister Mary Edgar, Sister Dolorita.
Oh.
She said, he apologized. Dad apologized to her.
I did.
When he saw her many years later, and she said, "Oh, Michael, you weren't bad. You were just mischievous." And then there's one of our parishioners, Sister Anita Floor. Her sister-in-law played the organ here many years while I was growing up during the 80s. And she lived to be almost 99 and passed away in 2010. Another of our parishioners who answered the call. And here's a picture of her when she first entered back in 1930. And that's one of her. Now, post-Vatican II to the new millennium, Monsignor Pitt, I mentioned the Pitt Academy, but he is unbelievably prominent. And the U.S. Department of Education sent him to Germany at the end of World War II to reestablish their education system. He was the first head of the Archdiocese of Louisville Catholic School Board. He started a TV show called The Moral Side of the News in 1952. It still runs today, 66 years later, and they'll have a Catholic priest, a Protestant pastor, a Jewish leader. They have different religions talking about topics of the day from each of their religious perspectives. He started that back in 1952. Extremely impressive guy, highly educated. All of his letters and information are stored at Bellarmine. He was the first president of the school board. The second president of the school board was Father McGee, whose great aunt was another Grace Simpson, believe it or not, who married a McGee, so he's got ties to St. Michael's as well. The best educator in the Archdiocese, as chosen every year by the Archdiocesan Board, is awarded the Father McGee Award. And again, that's got a little bit of a tie here as well. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the church in 1983 and the 200th anniversary of the parish in 1992. In 1983, here's a neat aerial view of the property. The church and the school, of course. There's no Gardner Hall. This didn't exist. The walnut trees had just been planted. You can see that they're very, very small at that stage. And then in 1992, of course, the church, we knew there was going to be a big crowd. The church wouldn't hold it, so we had a big tent located about where we are right now. Inside there were actually 3 bishops and Archbishop Kelly, and as you see, several priests that were here for that ceremony. The tent was absolutely full, and we had a string quartet that was playing during the Mass as well. It was a really impressive service. That is Brother Charles McGinnis. He was a Trappist that he grew up here in the parish. That's Mary Height. I thought she might try to be here tonight. She just couldn't make it. Liv Bixler, some of you will recognize over there to Brother McGinnis's left. And then here's a picture of him when he first joined at Gethsemane back in the 1940s. There he is there, straight out of St. Michael's. Now, Father Malachi. Father Malachi was, he grew up in the parish, and his name was Ivan Flaherty. And he lived out on Irish Ridge Road. He was one of the Irish families that had moved in here. And he became a Trappist monk over at Gethsemane and eventually moved. They established a new abbey in Utah, and he was the abbot. He was the head of it out there. And he would try to come back for some of the occasions, and he couldn't make the 200th anniversary, but wrote a letter saying he was with us in spirit. And here's a picture of him in 1929. He's the dark shirt right here in front. And that's Ivan Flaherty, now known as Father Malachi, who is still living, last I heard, in his mid-90s. Now, some of you recognize this guy. Father Al arrived in 1996. And I'm not sure what all to say about Father Al. He was something else. Not many priests have a beach house and a Jaguar, but Father Al did. And he was extremely generous. You would sign up, and every week during the summer, except the weeks he was going, he would let you go down, stay at his beach house. He would say, I'll only charge you for utilities, and then when you try to pay for the utilities, he wouldn't accept it. I remember every year on the Epiphany, he would bring all the kids up to the front after Mass and give them little statues or rosaries or different things. I remember him telling, every year he would tell the first reconciliation class, he would look at all of them and say, if you were the only person ever born, Jesus would have died for you. And I always thought that was a great message. So Father Al was great. He was extremely different as priests go. And I remember at his 50th, the 50th anniversary of his ordination, a friend of his that he was in Vietnam with, oh, by the way, he was a lieutenant colonel, military chaplain, and a friend of his who he's in Vietnam with had come down from Chicago to be here. And I remember very vividly Father Al's homily where he said, for the first time in 50 years, I have something written down. Because if you remember his homilies, it was usually it was entirely off the cuff. May not have been relevant at all. But for the first time in 50 years, I have something written down. I thought that was great. There's a plaque we have in the church honoring him for all he did. When he passed away, he donated a huge amount of money. He had a military pension and a lot of assets that he was extremely generous with us and left that to the parish. Father Al's funeral was significant for a couple of reasons. It was a full military funeral, which was extremely impressive. But the main thing I remember about it was Archbishop Kurtz being here to preside over the ceremony, and he had to rearrange his schedule to be here because Archbishop Kurtz had originally been scheduled to speak at another funeral that day for some guy named Muhammad Ali. And so Father Al, somewhere in heaven right now, I know, is telling that story. Guess what? Yeah, he was supposed to go to Ali's funeral, but instead he came to mine. I can see him now. There's Father Al's tombstone. He's buried in our cemetery by his request, which I thought was great. And I like the way the preference of his tombstone. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, Vietnam, and down at the bottom, Reverend.
How long was he with you all?
20 years.
Really?
Yeah, retired in residence here for 20 years. Yeah, he was retired when he got here. So-called. Father Batch can speak to that. Retired, right?
20 years.
All right, 21st century. 9/11. We all remember that. We had a very special mass that night, I remember. We weren't having, I don't think weekday masses every day, but I remember Father Al saying we're having mass tonight, and there were no text messages or anything yet then, and it was all word of mouth, but the church was full. Very powerful ceremony. Lightning strike on the new organ. The parish has always been generous. We had a $10,000 goal, and in 2 months we raised 20, so that was a pretty good deal as far as organ purchases go. And then it came time for a new parish hall. Father Joe Vest was our pastor at that time, and he passed away suddenly, and here we were trying to build this building with no priest, and then all of a sudden, da-da-da-da, Father Batch to the rescue. He came over to be our administrator during that time, which was extremely valuable because we were a rudderless ship, and I put on there just like the old days when we first got here and didn't have a priest. Here we were, what do we do now? And so Father Batch was very vital to us, and always is, of course, but especially during that time. And I know in his heart of hearts, the whole idea of his family history here probably made that important to him as well. The Building a Future of Hope campaign was when we restored the church. It was a restoration, not a renovation. Let's be clear about that. We did not want a renovation. And then the letter, of course, the letter story speaks for itself. But for those who don't know, the Blessed Mother altar with the statue was on the left as you go in, and of course the Joseph is on the right. But for those who don't know the story, there was, during the renovation, behind that statue, there was a letter found in there, and that letter was given to Jean Jury. And I'll never forget, we were having mass in here at the time because of the restoration. And she said, "Look at this. Do you know who this is?" And it was what appeared to be a prayer, a written prayer, and it was signed by Sally Pitt. And I said, "You're dang right I know who that is. That's Monsignor Pitt's mother. What is this?" And so she told me the story. They had found it behind the statue, and I'm reading it, and I'm realizing she's distraught. What is going on? And it was dated. So I thought, I think I know what that is. And luckily in the book, I have every burial that we have on record in here. So I looked up her husband, and it was the day he had died. And she was in the church, and she had written out a prayer and stuck it behind there. In essence, I guess, as Mary, you're the ultimate mother. What do I do? What do I do with this situation? I've got these kids, and now I don't have a husband. And so we had the letter framed, and it hangs in the back of church. I swiped it after Mass today just so I could bring it over here. There's the original with a printed version of what it says. But it says, dated May the 8th, 1902, "O God, I offer up my intense grief, my sorrow, for strength and grace to raise and care for my children. Do with me as thy will, O Lord. I abandon my soul to thee. Only give me grace to raise my children to be good men and women and save our souls." So at that time, Monsignor Pitt was about 8 years old, and I think he became one of those good men and women. And then, this is Monsignor Pitt's biography, written by a guy who was his great-nephew, and his first name was Pitt, after the Pitt family, Pitt Tone. And his grandmother was Sally Pitt, who wrote the letter. And I said, holy cow, yes.
Sally Pitt and my grandmother were sisters.
Oh.
Is that right? I didn't know that. So there you go.
But my dad and Father Pitt were first cousins.
Okay. Yeah.
Remember you were having trouble getting this thing printed?
Yeah.
You couldn't get it printed, and it extension on top of extension.
Yeah, the book she means, because the letter happened, the book was delayed 3 or 4 times, and it was taking weeks and weeks and weeks, and all of a sudden we get this letter, and I called him, I said, wait, hang on, and so literally the story of the letter is like the last 3 pages of the book, because I was finished, the whole thing was finished, and so we luckily, God waited for us to find the letter, and then we snuck it in there at the last minute. So yeah, so there's a Father Batch tie in there as well. But the author of this book, he remembered her very well. He said she taught me how to garden. She was very, very great. And at the time, she was living with Pitt Tone's mother. So it was, her daughter was taking care of her, another good person. So her prayer was very clearly answered. But that story of finding that letter back there, it was written in 1902, which means it was written 110 years after our parish had been started, and it was found 108 years after it was written. So it was just really, the whole thing was very strange. It was covered, of course, by the Record, by the Kentucky Standard, by TV stations out of Louisville and Lexington. It was a huge story around here, so we've got that very prominently displayed in the church. So there's a picture of what the church looked like before the restoration took place. And then here's the same picture after or during. So all the pews are gone. The communion rail, of course, is still there. Statues gone, altar gone, pictures gone, everything stripped out. And then here's a picture. It's like standing at the altar looking out toward the crowd. Again, everything's stripped out there. So here's what this hall looked like during that time, because this is where Mass was. I see St. Rita over there in the corner helping us keep everything straight. And then in the 225th anniversary last year, there's a picture of Mass. Archbishop Kirk's, of course, presiding. There's Father Johnny. Father Batch was here. Deacon Carl and Father Bill came back for that. We had invited him back because he was the pastor during the restoration process. And boy, that was a huge undertaking. More than $500,000 was raised in this parish, which is phenomenal, and Father Bill was very instrumental in that. So, where are we today? There we are. There's our church, 135 years strong. We have a lot of fun around here. Sometimes it goes a bit too far. That was our fundraiser for, I think, like the Texas. There was a hurricane in Texas or something last year. And Father Johnny, I don't know if you can tell, he's enjoying that way too much. And at Christmas time, we take the kids to go to the nursing home and sing Christmas carols. That's a picture of us doing that. And then every Halloween, we have the haunted hayride. And that's a picture of us doing that from last year. So good times around here. Now, earlier this year, Clement Gardner, who's kind of our patriarch, was recognized by the Children of the American Revolution for his service in the Revolution, and they put that there. One of the problems with our cemetery is some of the original settlers are surely buried here, and we don't know where. Their tombstones are gone, and so we had looked and looked to try to figure out where he was buried, and we couldn't find it. So they placed that actually right in front of the little bench where our original church was located. So it was a great ceremony. You see all the nice wreaths and everything there. They had some Revolutionary War reenactors that came for it. And then there's a picture of the tent area where everybody was seated, American flags, different flags representing everything there. And then here's the reception afterward. This guy was great. He was very authentic looking Revolutionary War guy. Our parish, again, going way back to the beginning, we were known as the cradle of religious vocations, and we're still carrying that on strong. Grace is here. She's an Ursuline sister. Mimi's an Ursuline sister. Father Malachi is still ticking along out in Utah. That abbey out there actually closed. He's now in a nursing home, the last I heard. And then Karen Hall, who grew up here, is a Carmelite, and she goes by Sister Martha of Jesus is her name there. Now, if I can get my CCD kids back up here, we're about to wrap up, but I want them back up here one more time because, as this says, this is what I call Holy Land. Because we're talking about the Holy Lands here in a scenario of approximately 1805 or so. Here's what we had. From a little cheat sheet. And Colin. Can you come too, Colin, please? So when you think back to in 1805, this parish was just getting started. It was 13 years old. And so here's what we had. We had Father Baden, the first priest ordained in the United States.
Just for the record, Mother Catherine, I just found that in my basement. It wasn't anything special to painting.
Ah, very good. All right. And so then we have, and I've got these people designated. This here is a young man named Joseph Adams. He was the son of an original parishioner and later became Father Adams. And he became a Jesuit and was a highly esteemed college professor at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. Look at it, just looks very educated. Very good. All right, very good. Now, this is one of the Gardner girls. This is Harriet Gardner. She was the grandson of Clement Gardner, the granddaughter of Clement Gardner, the daughter of Joseph Gardner, who was the gentleman who got the one guy drunk and made him sign the petition. But nonetheless, she was one of the first sisters into the Order of the Sisters of Charity. And she actually kept her name Harriet, only one of the three girls that kept her given name, and was very prominent in their history. So, Trinity, step over here, please. This is Charlotte Gardner, and she became known as Sister Claire. She was another one of the Gardner girls and became a sister of charity later in her life. And then let's have Kendall. You come over here. This is Elizabeth Gardner, and she later became Mother Frances Gardner, or Little Moses, and lived to be to 1878 and was over 20 years, I think, as the Mother Superior. The tall gentleman there with the glasses on, that's Richard Miles, the first bishop in the state of Tennessee, a Dominican who later became that bishop. The gentleman next to him is Stephen Montgomery, and he was the son of an original parishioner, and he went to St. Rose and joined the Dominican order, and was a very prominent teacher at St. Joseph College, as was his little brother Samuel Montgomery, who's standing there beside him. They were brothers, and they both were Dominicans and both taught at the school. Next to him is Athanasius Aud, the guy I showed the picture of earlier. Very prominent guy, and was the chaplain at the Calvary Convent for many years. And then I'm going to skip to the end there. That's Ann Spalding, Mother Catherine's little sister, who joined the Sisters of Charity a few years after. And then right there in the midst of it all is Mother Catherine Spalding, who grew up in the parish. Now here's the thing. All of that was going on our property in the early 1800s. The first priest in the United States, the first bishop in the state of Tennessee, the only woman with a statue on public land in the state of Kentucky, and many, many more doing prominent things. So when we say, what are the Kentucky Holy Lands, this is it right here. Okay, thank you all very much. Last slide of the night. Can I get an amen? No, I'm kidding. So Father Malachi, I got to go back to him, because before the letter came about, I had spent a long time on this thing, and then finally thought, how do you find a conclusion to this story? What in the world am I going to do to give it a proper conclusion to where it doesn't just fall flat? So Father Malachi fixed that for me. The first time I reached out and found out he was out there, I emailed the Abbey and said, Father Malachi is a parishioner of my parish. I'm writing a parish history, and I'm wondering does he have an email address that I can send him something? And I got a reply back from one of the monks that said, Father Malachi does not do email. You can write him a letter, and he may or may not write you back. And I said, all right, well, that's a good start. So I wrote him a letter, and I'll never forget the day I got it in the mail. The return address said Abbey of the Holy Trinity, Huntsville, Utah. And I was like a kid in school. And so I opened it up, and it was front and back, front and back, front and back. And it was fabulous. He told so many stories about his time growing up here. And so I wrote him back a letter just saying, thank you so much. I will use a great deal of this in my book. And about a week later, I got another letter from him. We were now pen pals. And it was another really, really long, detailed letter. And that second one, I found my conclusion. And because it sums up the idea of St. Michael so well, that's exactly what I used to conclude the book. And I'm going to read that a little bit to you. So he talks about basically very few times was he able to come back to the parish because of his commitments, and they weren't to go out in public very frequently. But he talks about one time, a couple of the times he came back. Usually I would go over to Fairfield to see St. Michael's Church, where my spiritual journey began. Sometimes my brothers were with me. We would look around the grounds of the church and in our imagination see the sisters' residence and the school just behind it. There were the 2 wooden pillars to which the school bell was attached. Near them, the boys would often draw a circle in the dirt and play marbles. The boys with strong hands could shoot their tall like a bullet. The ones with weaker hands would hunch a bit, which was considered unfair. There was a water container for drinking on the porch outside the big room. One day, Sister Mary Lawrence asked me to see how much water was in it. I lifted the lid and looked in. Sister, it's pert near full. She laughed and said, do not say pert near, but it's nearly full. The railing around the porch was used by the girls to beat the chalk dust out of the blackboard erasers. The yard behind the house was where the boys played ball. Sometimes Father Price would come out the back door of the rectory and watch the game for a while. The girls had their yard and games too. Skipping the rope and hopscotch seemed to have been their favorites, though most boys would not think it proper to know too much about what the girls did. My brothers and I borrowed the key to the church from the pastor and entered the church. On the right, next to the stations, 4 pews up from the rear, was the Flaherty pew. See, y'all talk about people being possessive of their pews. They were back then too. Gone was the big stove on the right, which glowed red hot in the cold mornings of winter. The church had a new lighting system now, and there was no need for ladies to bring fans for hot summer days. And the choir loft was blocked off now. It was at that time. But there was the main altar and the 2 side altars and the communion rail where we knelt to receive the Lord. And he was there just the same as in the old days in the tabernacle. From there it seemed appropriate to visit the cemetery where the first and the last parishioners were buried. As many friends and loved ones resting in the peace, as we walked around looking at the grave markers, we found many friends and loved ones resting in the peace of that quiet hillside. It reminded us that we too were on our way to join them. The life of a monk is not an isolated journey for his sanctification alone, but it involves all those others whom God has somehow associated with him along the way. Family, friends, and certainly his fellow parishioners, and those many others known only to God. No man is an island. With this, the account is pert near full. Pray for me, Father Malachi. So that was the obvious conclusion to the book. And just like, so since Father Malachi and I are buddies and he wrote the conclusion, he's also the conclusion of the presentation. So that is it. Thanks again to the kids. Thanks again to Sister Rita. And thanks again to everybody who helped prepare the food. I had a great time. I hope you all did as well. Thank you.